In the dusty frontier town of Dry Creek, young cattle baron Beau McAllister thought he was inviting the saloon's kitchen maid to his poker table for a good laugh. Annie Lou Carter, barely 21, with flour under her fingernails and a shy smile, seemed like easy entertainment for the town's wealthy elite. But when she quietly took her seat among the ranchers, bankers, and businessmen, something extraordinary happened. Hand after hand, she dismantled every player at the table with the precision of a master craftsman. This wasn't beginner's luck, this was the work of someone who'd been raised by a riverboat gambler grandfather, someone who could read faces like weather patterns and bluff with the conviction of a Sunday preacher. What started as a joke quickly became the talk of the territory, as word spread about the maid who could outplay any man in the county. But when a dangerous card shark arrives in town with a rigged game designed to destroy her, will the very man who invited her as entertainment be willing to risk everything to help her survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Dry Creek, a frontier town that had grown from a single trading post into a bustling hub of commerce and cattle. Adobe buildings lined the dusty thoroughfare, their flat roofs and thick walls a testament to the harsh summers and bitter winters that defined life in this corner of the territory. The Red River Saloon stood at the heart of it all, its swinging doors having witnessed more deals, disputes, and dreams than any other establishment for 100 miles in any direction. Annie Lou Carter pushed through the kitchen's back door, her arms laden with flour sacks that would feed the saloon's patrons through another week. At 21, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself slowly: dark hair, always pulled back in a practical bun, eyes the color of creek water after a spring rain, and hands that spoke of honest work. Her calico dress, mended more times than she could count, hung simply on her slight frame. She moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that every moment counted, every penny mattered. "Morning, Annie Lou," called Martha Hendricks, the saloon's owner, from behind the bar. Martha was a woman who had seen enough of life to know that survival required both strength and wisdom. She had taken Annie Lou under her wing 3 years ago, when the girl had arrived in town with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a determination that impressed even the most hardened frontier residents. "Morning, Miss Martha," Annie Lou replied, her voice carrying the soft cadence of someone raised along the river bottoms. "I'll have the bread started directly. Heard tell Mr. McAllister's hosting another of his poker nights come Friday." Martha's expression shifted slightly, the way it always did when Beau McAllister's name entered conversation. The young cattle baron commanded respect in Dry Creek, but Martha had lived long enough to know that wealth and character didn't always walk hand in hand. "That boy's got more money than sense sometimes," she said, wiping down glasses with practiced movements. "But his gatherings do bring business to the saloon." Annie Lou nodded, her mind already calculating the extra provisions they would need. These poker nights were legendary in the territory's smoke-filled affairs, where the region's wealthy men gathered to test their luck and display their prosperity. She had served at enough of them to know the ritual: expensive whiskey, Cuban cigars, and steaks that exceeded what most families earned in a year. The participants treated these events like exclusive clubs, their laughter and boasts echoing through the saloon long into the night. As she worked, Annie Lou's thoughts drifted to the worn deck of playing cards hidden in her room upstairs. The cards had belonged to her grandfather, Ezra Whitman, a man whose reputation on the riverboats had been both legendary and cautionary. The deck was weathered from countless hands, its edges soft with age, each card bearing the faint impressions of fingers that had known both triumph and disaster. Ezra had been the one to raise her after her parents died in a cholera outbreak when she was 7. He had been a contradiction, a gentleman gambler who could quote Shakespeare and calculate odds with equal skill, yet who had chosen to live on the margins of society. His riverboat, the Lady Luck, had been both home and classroom for Annie Lou during her formative years. Cards ain't about luck, little one, he had told her countless times, his weathered hands demonstrating the subtle art of reading opponents. They're about understanding people, their fears, their hopes, their tells. Every soul carries their truth in their face, if you know how to look. Under his tutelage, Annie Lou had learned to read the subtle signs that betrayed a bluffer's hand, the slight tightening around the eyes, the unconscious touching of the throat, the way breathing changed when stakes rose. Ezra had taught her to think several moves ahead, to manage not just cards but emotions, to understand that the greatest victories often came not from the best hands, but from the best decisions. But Ezra's lessons had come with warnings. "This life I've chosen," he had said during one of their last conversations before his death, "it's not meant for everyone. You've got the gift, Annie Lou, but you also have the choice to use it differently than I did. Remember that respect earned honestly lasts longer than money won at cards." Those words had guided her decision to seek honest work when she arrived in Dry Creek. She had deliberately chosen the kitchen over the gaming tables, seeking the dignity of earned wages over the uncertainty of gambling. Yet the skills remained, dormant but sharp, like a blade kept in its sheath. The morning progressed with its usual rhythms. Annie Lou prepared the day's meals while Martha managed the front of the house, their partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to be women making their way in a man's world. The saloon's other employees, Tom the bartender, Jake who kept the peace when negotiations turned violent, and Sarah who helped with the evening, crowd-formed a family of sorts, bound by the common goal of survival and the shared hope of something better. Around mid-morning, the conversation turned to the topic that had been weighing on Annie Lou's mind for weeks. "Miss Martha," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I received another letter from the bank yesterday." Martha's hands stilled on the glass she was cleaning. She knew about Annie Lou's mother's homestead, the small plot of land, 20 miles north of town, that represented everything the girl held dear. Sarah Carter had been a schoolteacher, a woman who had dreamed of building something lasting in the wilderness. She had saved every penny to purchase the land, intending to create a place where knowledge and hope could flourish together. "What did it say?" Martha asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. 3 months, Annie Lou replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I can't make the payment, they'll foreclose. Mr. Jameson at the bank says he's been more than patient, but business is business." The amount needed was staggering by Annie Lou's standards, $300, more than 2 years' worth of her kitchen wages. She had been saving every penny since arriving in Dry Creek, but honest work, no matter how diligent, moved slowly toward such a sum. Martha set down her glass and looked at the young woman with the kind of compassion that comes from understanding hardship. "That land means everything to you, doesn't it?" Annie Lou nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "It's all I have left of her. She used to read to me there, under the old oak tree. She had such plans, wanted to start a school, help children learn to read and write. She believed education could change everything." The homestead represented more than property to Annie Lou. It was a connection to her mother's dreams, a tangible link to the woman who had instilled in her a belief that circumstances didn't have to define destiny. Sarah Carter had been a woman of letters in a world that often dismissed such things, but she had never let that discourage her vision of a better future. "Have you considered?" Martha began, then stopped herself. She had been about to suggest that Annie Lou might use her gambling skills to earn the money quickly, but something in the girl's expression made her reconsider. There was a pride there, a determination to succeed through honest means that Martha admired, even as she worried about its practicality. "I've thought about everything," Annie Lou said, understanding the unspoken suggestion. "But I promised myself when I came here that I'd make my way honestly. Grandfather always said that respect earned through honest work lasts longer than money won at cards." Martha nodded, respecting the decision, even as she wondered if such principles were luxuries that poverty couldn't afford. "Well," she said finally, "let's see what opportunities present themselves. Sometimes the world has a way of opening doors when we need them most." As the day progressed, Annie Lou threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She kneaded bread with fierce concentration, as if the rhythm of her hands could somehow knead a solution from the uncertainty that surrounded her. The kitchen became her sanctuary, a place where she could control at least some small corner of her world. The afternoon brought its usual parade of customer cowboys seeking meals and whiskey, traveling merchants needing rest and information, local residents conducting the business of daily life. Annie Lou observed them all from her position in the kitchen, her grandfather's training making her naturally attuned to the subtle dramas that played out in every interaction. There was confidence in the way some men carried themselves, the kind that came from never having to worry about next month's rent. There was desperation in others, carefully hidden but visible to those who knew how to look. And there was the constant dance of social hierarchy, the unspoken rules that determined who spoke to whom and how conversations flowed. Beau McAllister arrived in the early evening, his presence immediately commanding attention in the way that wealth and youth often did. At 26, he possessed the kind of natural charisma that made people want to please him, even when they weren't sure why. His dark hair was always perfectly groomed, his clothes cut from the finest materials that money could buy in the territory. He moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his place in it. "Evening, Martha," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I wanted to confirm arrangements for Friday's game. We'll need the private room, and I trust you'll provide your usual excellent service." "Of course, Mr. McAllister," Martha replied, her tone professional but warm. Despite her reservations about the young man's character, she couldn't deny that he treated her establishment with respect and paid his bills promptly. From the kitchen, Annie Lou watched the interaction with the trained eye her grandfather had developed in her. Beau's gestures were expansive, his smile genuine but perhaps a bit too conscious of its effect. He was a man who had learned early that charm could open doors that might otherwise remain closed, and he used that knowledge with the casual skill of someone who had never been forced to consider the consequences of its failure. "Will it be the usual group?" Martha asked, already knowing the answer. "Most of them," Beau replied. "Judge Harrison, Dr. Matthews, Bill Jameson from the bank, and a few others. Should be a good evening." He paused, his gaze sweeping the saloon's interior. "You know, I've been thinking about ways to make these gatherings more entertaining." Martha's expression remained neutral, but Annie Lou caught the slight shift in her posture that suggested caution. "What did you have in mind?" Beau's smile widened, and Annie Lou felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Oh, nothing too elaborate, just thinking it might be amusing to invite some of the local talent to join us, add a bit of local color to the proceedings." The way he said talent made it clear that he wasn't referring to the town's musicians or storytellers. Martha's response was measured but firm. "Mr. McAllister, I run a respectable establishment. I'm sure you understand." "Of course," Beau said quickly, his tone suggesting he had expected this reaction. "I wouldn't dream of compromising your reputation, Martha. I was thinking more along the lines of, well, what harm could there be in inviting your kitchen help to observe? Might be educational for them to see how business is conducted among men of substance." Annie Lou felt her cheeks burn with indignation, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She understood exactly what Beau was suggesting, that the serving staff might provide entertainment for the gambling men, objects of amusement rather than individuals deserving of respect. Martha's response was swift and decisive. "My employees are here to work, Mr. McAllister, not to provide entertainment for your guests. I'm sure you can find your amusement elsewhere." Beau raised his hands in mock surrender, his smile never wavering. "Of course, Martha. I meant no offense. Just a passing thought." He placed several bills on the bar. "For Friday's arrangements, I trust everything will be ready." As he left, Annie Lou found herself studying his retreating figure with new interest. Her grandfather had taught her that true character revealed itself not in grand gestures but in small moments, in the way people treated those who couldn't benefit them. Beau McAllister's suggestion had revealed something about his character that all his charm couldn't disguise. Yet as she returned to her work, Annie Lou couldn't shake the feeling that Friday's poker game might prove to be more significant than anyone anticipated. The homestead deadline pressed against her thoughts like a physical weight, and she found herself wondering if there might be opportunities that honest work alone couldn't provide. The evening progressed with its usual rhythms, but Annie Lou's mind kept returning to the worn deck of cards upstairs and the lessons her grandfather had taught her. Perhaps, she thought, respect and honest work didn't have to be mutually exclusive with using the skills she possessed. Perhaps there was a way to honor both her grandfather's teachings and her mother's dreams. As she prepared for another night of service, Annie Lou Carter had no idea that her life was about to change forever. That the intersection of necessity and opportunity would soon present her with choices that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Friday evening arrived with the kind of anticipation that made the air itself seem charged with possibility. Annie Lou had spent the day preparing for what she knew would be one of the saloon's busiest nights, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she readied the private dining room where Beau McAllister's poker game would unfold. The foreclosure notice sat folded in her apron pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the deadline that approached like storm clouds on a clear horizon. The private room had been transformed for the occasion. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, creating an intimate atmosphere lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The poker table dominated the space, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship made from solid oak, its surface worn smooth by countless games of chance and skill. This was the artifact that would change everything, the stage upon which Annie Lou's hidden talents would finally emerge from the shadows of necessity. Martha had outdone herself with the preparations. Crystal glasses caught the lamplight, reflecting it in prismatic patterns across the table's green felt surface. The finest whiskey the saloon could offer waited in cut-glass decanters, while Cuban cigars rested in their humidor like sleeping promises of luxury. Everything spoke of wealth and privilege, a world where men could afford to risk more money in a single evening than most people saw in a year. Beau arrived first, as was his custom, wanting to survey his domain before his guests appeared. He wore his finest coat, midnight blue with silver buttons that caught the light as he moved. His confidence filled the room like expensive cologne, and Annie Lou found herself observing him with the analytical eye her grandfather had trained her to use when assessing opponents. "Everything looks perfect, Martha," Beau said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose expectations had been met. He walked around the table, testing each chair, adjusting the position of the cards and chips with the precision of someone who understood that atmosphere could influence outcomes as much as skill. The other players began arriving as the evening deepened. Judge Harrison entered with the measured dignity of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Dr. Matthews followed, his medical bag set aside for the evening, but his careful eyes still assessing everyone around him with clinical precision. Bill Jameson from the bank came next, the man who held the power to foreclose on Annie Lou's mother's homestead, though he remained unaware of her connection to that particular piece of business. Annie Lou served the initial round of drinks, moving through the room like a ghost, present but unnoticed by the men who had gathered to test their fortunes against one another. She had learned long ago that servants became invisible to those above them in station, a phenomenon that allowed her to observe without being observed in return. "Gentlemen," Beau announced once everyone had settled into their chairs, "welcome to another evening of civilized competition. May your cards be favorable and your luck hold steady." The game began with the ritual that Annie Lou recognized from her grandfather's teachings. The dealing of the first hands, the careful examination of cards, the initial betting that established the evening's tone. She watched from her position near the sideboard, ostensibly ready to refill glasses or provide whatever the players might need, but actually studying each man's approach to the game. Judge Harrison played with the same methodical caution he brought to his courtroom, never rushing decisions, always considering angles that others might miss. Dr. Matthews treated poker like a medical diagnosis, gathering information before committing to any course of action. Bill Jameson, perhaps unsurprisingly for a banker, focused on risk assessment, rarely making moves that weren't backed by solid mathematical probability. But it was Beau who commanded the table, his natural charisma translating into an aggressive playing style that put pressure on his opponents. He understood the psychological aspects of the game, using his charm and confidence to influence others' decisions as much as the cards themselves. As the evening progressed, the stakes gradually increased. What had begun as genteel entertainment slowly transformed into something more serious, more competitive. The men's true natures began to emerge as money changed hands and pride became as much a factor as profit. Annie Lou found herself mentally playing along with each hand, her grandfather's voice echoing in her memory as she calculated odds and read the subtle tells that each player displayed. Judge Harrison touched his temple when he held strong cards. Dr. Matthews drummed his fingers when bluffing. Bill Jameson's breathing grew slightly shallow when he was uncertain about his position. It was during the fourth hand of the evening that everything changed. Beau had just won a significant pot, his stack of chips growing impressively, when he looked up and caught sight of Annie Lou standing quietly by the wall. "You know, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested mischief was brewing, "I've been thinking about what I mentioned to Martha earlier this week, about adding some local entertainment to our gathering." The other men looked up from their cards with varying degrees of interest and confusion. "What kind of entertainment?" Judge Harrison asked, his tone suggesting he was prepared to disapprove of whatever suggestion might be forthcoming. Beau's smile widened as his gaze fixed on Annie Lou. "Well, what if we invited some of the local talent to join our game? Just for the novelty of it, you understand. Might be amusing to see how the common folk approach the art of poker." Annie Lou felt her cheeks burn with indignation, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She understood exactly what Beau was proposing, that she and possibly the other staff members serve as entertainment for the wealthy men, objects of amusement rather than legitimate participants. "I hardly think that's appropriate, Beau," Dr. Matthews said, though his tone suggested more concern for propriety than for the feelings of those being discussed. "Oh, come now," Beau replied, his confidence growing as he warmed to his theme. "What harm could there be? We'll start them with small stakes, nothing they can't afford to lose. Think of it as educational, for them and for us." Annie Lou found herself at a crossroads that seemed to crystallize in the space of a single heartbeat. The foreclosure notice in her pocket felt heavier than lead, the deadline pressing against her consciousness like a physical weight. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, little one, opportunity and necessity arrive at the same moment. The wise person recognizes when that moment has come." Before she could reconsider, before the practical voice in her head could offer objections, Annie Lou stepped forward from her position against the wall. "I'd be honored to accept your invitation, Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. The room fell silent. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to amusement to outright disbelief. Beau's smile faltered for just a moment, as if he hadn't quite expected his suggestion to be accepted so readily. "I beg your pardon," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who wasn't certain he had heard correctly. "I said I'd be honored to join your game," Annie Lou repeated, moving closer to the table. "That is what you were suggesting, isn't it, that the local folk might participate?" Beau recovered his composure quickly, his smile returning with renewed brilliance. "Well, well, how delightfully unexpected. Yes, of course, that's exactly what I was suggesting. Gentlemen, it appears we have a volunteer." The other men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their reservations, but none wanted to appear less sporting than their host. After a brief consultation, they agreed to allow Annie Lou to join the game, though they established what they considered appropriately small stakes for someone of her station. Annie Lou took the empty chair that had been intended for a potential 6th player, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The foreclosure notice seemed to whisper encouragement from her pocket as she accepted the cards that Beau dealt with theatrical flourish. Her first hand was modest, a pair of sevens, nothing spectacular, but playable under the right circumstances. As betting commenced, Annie Lou found herself analyzing not just her own cards, but the entire dynamic of the table. Her grandfather's training took over, years of observation and instruction, coalescing into instinctive understanding. She won the first hand with careful, conservative play, much to the amusement of the other players. "Beginner's luck," Bill Jameson observed, with indulgent condescension. The second hand brought her a straight, and she won again, this time with slightly more aggressive betting that surprised the men around the table. Their amusement began to mix with curiosity as they realized that perhaps the kitchen maid knew more about cards than they had initially assumed. By the fifth hand, the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Annie Lou had won 3 of the 5 hands, her chip stack growing steadily, while those of the other players diminished. More importantly, she had begun to display a level of skill that went far beyond beginner's luck. "Fascinating," Dr. Matthews murmured as Annie Lou's straight flush demolished what had seemed like a sure win for Judge Harrison. "Where exactly did you learn to play cards, Miss Carter?" "My grandfather taught me," Annie Lou replied simply, her voice giving no indication of the intensity of focus required to maintain her performance. "He used to say that poker was less about the cards than about understanding people." Beau's expression had grown thoughtful, his initial amusement replaced by something approaching genuine interest. "Your grandfather was a gambling man, then?" "He was many things," Annie Lou said, accepting the cards for the next hand. "But yes, he understood games of chance and skill." As the evening progressed, word of the extraordinary events in the private room began to spread throughout the saloon. Martha appeared in the doorway more than once, her expression mixing concern with amazement as she watched her kitchen maid systematically outplay some of the most successful men in the territory. Other patrons found excuses to pass by the room, catching glimpses of the unprecedented scene unfolding within. Annie Lou Carter, the quiet young woman who served their meals and cleaned their tables, was demonstrating a mastery of poker that left experienced players shaking their heads in disbelief. The turning point came during what would later be remembered as the hand of the evening. Annie Lou had been dealt what appeared to be a weak-hander, 2 and 7 of different suits, about as poor as poker could offer. Yet something in the way the other players were betting, some combination of tells and timing that her grandfather's training allowed her to read like printed words, told her that this was the moment for a masterful bluff. She raised the stakes dramatically, her bet large enough to give even the wealthy men around the table pause. One by one, they folded, unwilling to risk their substantial holdings against what they were beginning to recognize as a force they had seriously underestimated. When Annie Lou revealed her worthless hand, the silence that followed was profound. She had won a pot worth more than she made in 3 months of kitchen work, and she had done it with nothing but skill, courage, and an understanding of human nature that impressed even the most cynical observers. "Remarkable," Judge Harrison said finally, his voice carrying a respect that had been entirely absent at the beginning of the evening. "Absolutely remarkable." As the formal game concluded and the men began to settle their accounts, Annie Lou found herself in possession of winnings that represented a significant step towards saving her mother's homestead. More importantly, she had demonstrated abilities that transformed her from an object of amusement into someone who commanded genuine respect. But as she carefully counted her chips, converting them into the currency that would help secure her future, Annie Lou was aware that she had also crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. Word of the evening's events would spread throughout Dry Creek and beyond, bringing both opportunities and dangers that she couldn't yet fully anticipate. The foreclosure notice in her pocket no longer felt quite so heavy, but she understood that her problems were far from solved. Tonight had been a beginning rather than an ending, the first step on a path that would test not just her gambling skills, but her character, her courage, and her ability to navigate a world where talent and determination weren't always enough to guarantee success. As the players departed and the saloon returned to its normal rhythms, Annie Lou remained at the poker table, her hands resting on the green felt surface that had witnessed her transformation from servant to player. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people possess the most extraordinary gifts. The oak poker table had served its purpose as the stage for her emergence, but Annie Lou understood that this was only the first act in a drama whose conclusion remained unwritten. Sunday afternoon brought unexpected developments that would reshape Annie Lou's understanding of her situation and the forces arrayed both for and against her newfound reputation. Beau McAllister arrived at the Red River Saloon, carrying his grandfather's silver pocket watcher family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of cattle barons, each adding their own scratches and memories to its polished surface. The watch represented not just wealth, but the weight of family expectations and the responsibility that came with inherited position in frontier society. As Beau approached Annie Lou in the saloon's main room, she noticed that his usual confident demeanor had been tempered by something approaching genuine concern. The events of Friday evening had clearly affected him in ways that went beyond mere entertainment or business opportunity, forcing him to confront the reality that his casual invitation had unleashed consequences neither of them had anticipated. "Annie Lou," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that marked their changed relationship. "I've been doing considerable thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I believe we need to discuss some developments that have occurred since then." She gestured toward a quiet table near the window, where the afternoon light would allow them to speak privately without attracting undue attention from other patrons. As they settled into their chairs, Annie Lou noticed that Beau seemed less certain than usual, his confidence replaced by the kind of careful consideration that suggested he was weighing factors more complex than simple profit and loss. "I've received additional telegrams about opportunities in the territory," Beau began, his fingers unconsciously stroking the silver watch as if drawing strength from its familiar weight. "But I've also received information that concerns me greatly regarding the attention your success has attracted." Annie Lou waited for him to continue, her grandfather's training having taught her the value of listening completely before responding, especially when conversations involved subjects as serious as the one Beau seemed prepared to discuss. "There are men in this territory who view gambling as their exclusive province," Beau continued, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "Your success represents a challenge to their monopoly that some of them are prepared to address through methods that extend beyond the gaming table." The warning echoed concerns that Dr. Matthews and Sheriff Webb had expressed, but coming from Beau, it carried additional weight because of his connections to the wealthy circles, where such matters were often discussed with greater frankness than public conversations allowed. "What specific concerns have you heard?" Beau hesitated before answering, his expression suggesting he was choosing his words carefully to convey serious information without causing unnecessary alarm. "There's talk in certain circles about organizing resistance to what they're calling outside interference in established gambling territories. Some of that talk has focused specifically on preventing further disruption of the current arrangements." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the serious nature of what Beau was describing. Annie Lou understood that she had inadvertently challenged a system that some people were willing to defend through whatever means might prove necessary. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha, whose expression carried the kind of gravity that suggested she had news of her own to share. Martha's usual warmth was tempered by obvious concern as she approached their table with movements that indicated reluctance to interrupt but necessity that couldn't be delayed. "I apologize for the intrusion," Martha said, "but there are matters that require immediate discussion. Annie Lou, you've received visitors while you were occupied with Mr. McAllister." "What kind of visitors?" "Men claiming to represent business interests from Silverton," Martha replied, her tone suggesting that she had found their claimed identity less than convincing. "They were asking detailed questions about your background, your family, and your future plans regarding gambling activities." The news sent a chill through Annie Lou's consciousness as she realized that her activities were being investigated by people whose motives remained unclear, but whose methods suggested purposes that extended beyond casual curiosity. Did they leave any messages or requests for meetings? They said they would return tomorrow to discuss opportunities that might interest you, Martha replied. But their questions seemed more focused on gathering intelligence than on offering legitimate business propositions. Beau's expression darkened as he absorbed this information, his earlier concerns clearly validated by developments that suggested Annie Lou's situation was more complicated than any of them had initially understood. "This confirms what I was attempting to explain," Beau said grimly. "Your success has attracted attention from people who prefer to operate through investigation and pressure rather than direct confrontation." As they continued their discussion, other patrons began arriving for the Sunday meal that the saloon provided for those who preferred not to cook for themselves. Among the newcomers was Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher whose earlier criticism of Annie Lou's gambling activities had been tempered by recent events that demonstrated the complex realities of frontier survival. Sarah approached their table with the determined stride of someone who had made decisions that required courage to implement, her expression carrying a mixture of concern and resolve that suggested she had news of considerable importance. "Annie Lou," Sarah said without preamble, "I hope you don't mind my joining your conversation, but I have information that I believe you need to hear." "Of course, Miss Jenkins. Please sit down." Sarah settled into the fourth chair, her teacher's instincts making her immediately aware of the tension that existed between Annie Lou and Beau regarding the dangers that her gambling success had created. "I've been speaking with women throughout the community," Sarah began, "and we've reached some conclusions about recent developments that affect not only you but all of us who live in Dry Creek." Annie Lou waited for her to continue, understanding that Sarah's perspective as an educated woman who understood community dynamics might provide insights that the men's focus on gambling politics had overlooked. "The men who visited today weren't just gathering information about you," Sarah continued. "They were asking questions about the entire community, who holds influence, who makes decisions, and how local affairs are generally conducted. Their interest extends well beyond gambling into areas that affect everyone." The revelation transformed Annie Lou's understanding of her situation from a personal conflict into a community issue that had implications for people who had no connection to gambling activities. Her success had apparently marked Dry Creek itself as a place requiring investigation by outside interests. What kind of questions were they asking? Questions about law enforcement capabilities, about community leadership, about economic activities and who controls them, Sarah replied. The kinds of questions that suggest they're evaluating whether Dry Creek might be suitable for expansion of their operations. Beau's expression grew even more serious as he realized that Annie Lou's gambling success might have attracted attention from criminal organizations that viewed successful frontier towns as opportunities for establishing new territories of influence. "This is worse than I thought," he said quietly. "If they're investigating the community as a whole, it suggests they're considering establishing permanent operations here rather than simply addressing a single competitive threat." The conversation continued, with growing awareness that the situation had evolved beyond anything they had initially imagined. Annie Lou's poker victory had apparently served as a signal to criminal organizations that Dry Creek was prosperous enough to be worth their attention, creating dangers that extended to everyone in the community. As afternoon faded toward evening, the three of them developed a preliminary understanding of the forces that were converging on their small town. Annie Lou's gambling skills had opened doors that she hadn't known existed, but they had also attracted attention from people whose interests extended far beyond fair competition at gaming tables. The silver pocket watch in Beau's hand seemed to tick with increasing urgency as they discussed options that ranged from retreat to resistance, each carrying risks that could affect not only Annie Lou's future, but the safety and independence of the entire community. Martha rejoined their conversation as the saloon began filling with evening patrons, her presence adding practical experience to their theoretical discussions about how to handle threats that none of them had faced before. "The way I see it," Martha said with the directness that marked all her important communications, "we have two choices. We can hope these people lose interest and move on to easier targets, or we can prepare to defend what we've built here." "What would preparation involve?" Annie Lou asked, though she suspected the answer would require more courage than she felt prepared to summon. "It would involve standing together as a community," Martha replied. "These people operate by isolating their targets and using fear to prevent resistance. But they're less effective when facing organized opposition from people who refuse to be intimidated." As the evening progressed and the saloon filled with its usual Sunday crowd, Annie Lou found herself contemplating choices that seemed to offer no entirely satisfactory outcomes. Her gambling success had created opportunities for financial security, but it had also exposed her community to dangers that threatened everything they had worked to build. The silver watch continued its steady ticking, marking time that might be running short for peaceful resolution of conflicts that were growing more complex with each passing hour. Annie Lou understood that her next decisions would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the future of everyone she cared about in Dry Creek. Beau's family heirloom served as a tangible reminder that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided, regardless of the personal costs they might entail, and that sometimes individuals were called upon to risk everything they valued in defense of principles that extended far beyond personal interest. The following Tuesday brought an unexpected visit from Sheriff Clayton Webb, a man whose presence at the Red River Saloon typically signaled trouble of one sort or another. His badge caught the morning light as he entered, the silver star representing law and order in a territory where both were often matters of personal interpretation rather than formal statute. Webb was a fair man by frontier standards, someone who understood that justice sometimes required flexibility, but who never lost sight of the principles that made civilization possible in wild places. Annie Lou was rolling pie dough when Martha announced his arrival, her tone carrying the careful neutrality that marked interactions with representatives of authority. Through the kitchen doorway, Annie Lou could see Webb removing his hat and smoothing his graying hair, gestures that suggested this was a formal visit rather than a social call. "Sheriff Webb," Martha said with professional courtesy, "what brings you by this morning?" "I need to speak with Miss Carter," he replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering news that might not be well received. "Nothing urgent, you understand, but there are matters that require discussion." Annie Lou wiped flour from her hands and joined them at the bar, her heart racing despite Webb's assurance that the situation wasn't urgent. In her experience, visits from law enforcement rarely brought good news, and her recent prominence in the community's gambling circles made her particularly sensitive to official scrutiny. "Miss Carter," Webb began, his expression serious but not unkind, "I've been hearing interesting stories about your recent activities. Word has a way of traveling in this territory, and some of those stories have reached ears that extend well beyond Dry Creek." The confirmation of her fears sent a chill through Annie Lou's chest. She had hoped that Friday evening's poker game would remain local gossip, but Webb's words suggested that her reputation was spreading through networks she hadn't considered. "What kind of stories, Sheriff?" "The kind that attract attention from people who make their living from cards and chance," Webb replied. "Some of that attention is merely professional interest, but some of it comes from individuals whose methods of competition extend beyond the gaming table." Martha's expression darkened at the implication. "Are you saying Annie Lou might be in danger?" "I'm saying that success in gambling often creates enemies as well as opportunities," Webb explained. "There are men in this territory who view any threat to their income as a threat that needs to be eliminated, and they don't always limit themselves to legal methods of elimination." Annie Lou felt the weight of the sheriff's words settle over her like a heavy cloak. Her grandfather had told her stories about players who used intimidation and violence when skill alone proved insufficient, but those tales had seemed like cautionary fiction rather than practical warnings about real dangers. "What would you recommend, Sheriff?" Webb considered his answer carefully, his fingers drumming against his badge in a rhythm that suggested he was weighing multiple factors. "Caution would be my first suggestion. Avoid games with players you don't know, especially those that take place outside of established venues like this saloon. If you do choose to continue gambling, make sure there are witnesses and that someone knows where you are." The advice was practical but limiting, potentially restricting Annie Lou's options just when she needed them most. The homestead deadline continued to approach, and cautious play might not generate the funds required to meet her obligations. "Is there specific intelligence about threats, or is this general concern?" "Both," Webb admitted. "I received a telegram yesterday from a colleague in Silverton. There's been talk in certain circles about a young woman in Dry Creek who's been winning substantial sums from prominent men. Some of that talk has come from people whose reputations suggest they might take direct action if they view her success as problematic." The news confirmed Annie Lou's worst fears about the consequences of her newfound reputation. Success in gambling, it seemed, carried risks that extended far beyond the financial losses that might result from poor play or bad luck. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Matthews, whose timing suggested that his visit might be related to Webb's concerns. The doctor's expression carried the gravity that marked his most serious consultations, and he approached their small group with obvious reluctance. "Sheriff, Martha, Miss Carter," he said with formal politeness. "I hope I'm not interrupting important business." "Actually, your timing is quite appropriate," Webb replied. "I was just discussing some concerns about Miss Carter's safety, and your medical perspective might be valuable." Dr. Matthews nodded grimly. "I had hoped I wouldn't need to share this information, but circumstances seem to require it. Yesterday evening, I treated a man in Silverton who had been severely beaten after a gambling dispute. The injuries were extensive, and the circumstances suggest that his attackers were professionals rather than angry amateurs." The clinical description sent a shiver of fear through Annie Lou's consciousness. Her grandfather's stories about gambling violence had always seemed distant and theoretical, but Dr. Matthews' medical testimony made the dangers feel immediate and personal. Was this related to the talk Sheriff Webb mentioned? "Indirectly," Dr. Matthews replied. "The victim had been boasting about a young woman from Dry Creek who had supposedly taken money from some of the territory's most prominent men. His comments were overheard by individuals who apparently took offense at the suggestion that local players might be vulnerable to outside competition." Annie Lou felt the walls of the saloon closing in around her as she realized that her success had created ripple effects extending far beyond her original intentions. Men she had never met were discussing her as if she were a threat to their livelihoods, and some were apparently willing to use violence to address perceived challenges to their dominance. "What would you recommend, Dr. Matthews?" "The same advice I would give any patient facing potential violence," he replied. "Avoid unnecessary risks, maintain awareness of your surroundings, and don't hesitate to seek help if you feel threatened. Your skills are remarkable, but they won't protect you from physical danger." As the doctor and sheriff departed, Annie Lou found herself alone with Martha and a growing sense that her options were narrowing with each passing day. The money from Friday evening's game remained safely hidden, but it represented only a partial solution to her problems. More concerning was the realization that her success had marked her as a target for people whose methods of competition extended far beyond the civilized boundaries of card games. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Judge Harrison, whose presence suggested official business rather than social interaction. Harrison was a man who commanded respect through a combination of intelligence, integrity, and the formal authority of his position, and his visit to discuss gambling matters struck Annie Lou as both unusual and potentially significant. "Miss Carter," he said with the measured dignity that marked all his public interactions, "I hope you'll forgive my presumption in calling upon you, but I have matters to discuss that might affect your future welfare." They settled at a corner table where their conversation would be relatively private, though Annie Lou noticed that several other patrons seemed unusually interested in observing their interaction. Harrison's reputation for fairness and wisdom made his opinions influential throughout the territory, and his assessment of her situation could affect how others regarded her choices. "I've been hearing remarkable stories about your recent gambling successes," Harrison began. "Stories that have impressed some people and concerned others, depending on their perspectives and interests. I hope my actions haven't created legal problems, Your Honor." "Not legal problems, exactly," Harrison replied, "but complications that might require careful navigation. The law regarding gambling in this territory is somewhat flexible, but the social and economic implications of your success extend beyond legal considerations." Annie Lou waited for him to elaborate, her grandfather's training having taught her to listen carefully when authority figures chose their words with obvious care. "There are men in this region who have built considerable wealth and influence through their gambling skills," Harrison continued. "Your emergence as a formidable player represents a challenge to their dominance that some may view as requiring correction." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the serious nature of Harrison's warning. Like Sheriff Webb and Dr. Matthews, he was suggesting that Annie Lou's success had created enemies who might resort to extra-legal methods of addressing their concerns about her competitive abilities. "Are you advising me to stop gambling entirely?" Harrison considered the question carefully, his judicial experience making him reluctant to offer advice without fully understanding all relevant factors. "I'm advising you to understand the full scope of the risks you're accepting. Gambling can be a legitimate form of entertainment and even income, but it can also attract the attention of people whose methods of competition extend beyond the gaming table." As their conversation concluded, Annie Lou found herself confronting the stark reality that her poker skills had created a situation where success and safety were potentially incompatible goals. The homestead deadline continued to approach, requiring funds that honest work couldn't provide in the time available, but pursuing those funds through gambling might expose her to dangers that could destroy far more than her financial security. The evening brought another visit from Beau McAllister, his arrival coinciding with the saloon's busiest hours in a way that seemed calculated to maximize the public nature of their interaction. His expression carried a seriousness that hadn't been present during their previous conversations, suggesting that he too had heard about the growing attention her reputation was attracting. "Annie Lou," he said, his use of her first name drawing attention from nearby patrons, "I think we need to discuss recent developments and how they might affect the opportunities we discussed." They found a quiet corner where they could speak without being overheard, though Annie Lou remained aware that their association was itself becoming a subject of public interest and speculation. "I've been hearing concerns about your safety," Beau began without preamble, "concerns that might affect any partnerships we might consider." "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that suggest your success has attracted attention from people who view competition as a threat to be eliminated rather than a challenge to be met honorably," Beau replied. "If we proceed with introducing you to larger games, we need to be prepared for responses that might extend beyond the gaming table." The warning echoed what Annie Lou had heard from Webb, Matthews, and Harrison, confirming her growing understanding that her gambling success had created a complex web of opportunities and dangers that required careful navigation. "Are you withdrawing your partnership offer?" Beau's expression suggested he was wrestling with competing considerations, the potential profits of their association balanced against the risks that such a partnership might entail for both of them. "Not withdrawing," he said finally, "but suggesting that we need to approach any future ventures with greater caution than I originally anticipated. Your skills are remarkable, but they've also marked you as someone that certain people might view as requiring management." As the evening wore on, and the saloon filled with its usual crowd of patrons, Annie Lou found herself observing the social dynamics with new awareness of how her presence affected the conversations and interactions around her. Some people regarded her with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with expressions that suggested calculation or resentment. The sheriff's badge had served its purpose as a symbol of the protection that law enforcement could provide. But Annie Lou understood that such protection had limits when dealing with people who operated outside legal boundaries. Her success at the poker table had earned her a reputation that extended far beyond Dry Creek, but with that reputation came responsibilities and dangers that she was only beginning to understand. As she prepared for another evening of service, Annie Lou Carter found herself standing at a crossroads where every path forward seemed to carry risks that might prove greater than the rewards she hoped to achieve. The homestead remained her primary goal, but the methods required to save it were creating complications that threatened to destroy more than her financial security. Friday morning arrived with news that changed everything. Tom Bradley, the telegraph operator, appeared at the Red River Saloon before dawn, his face pale, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from staying awake all night, wrestling with unwelcome information. In his trembling hand, he carried a yellow telegram that would shatter the relative calm Annie Lou had been trying to maintain since her poker victory the previous week. The telegraph message represented the outside world's intrusion into Dry Creek in the most direct possible way, a harbinger of events that would test everything Annie Lou thought she understood about her situation and her options. Martha accepted the telegram with growing concern, her expression darkening as she read its contents before passing it to Annie Lou with obvious reluctance. The message was brief but devastating. Jack the Shark, Morrison heading your direction, stop. Reputation for eliminating competition permanent. Stop arrival expected within week, stop. Advise extreme caution, stop. It was signed by someone named Patterson in Silverton, apparently one of the network of contacts that carried information about gambling activities throughout the territory. Annie Lou read the telegram twice before its full implications settled into her consciousness like stones dropping into still water. Jack Morrison was a name her grandfather had mentioned in cautionary tales, a professional gambler whose reputation extended far beyond skill at cards into areas that law enforcement agencies preferred not to investigate too closely. "Who is Jack Morrison?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she feared the answer. "Someone my grandfather used to warn me about," Annie Lou replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man who eliminates competition, not through superior play, but through methods that ensure his opponents can't continue playing." The telegraph's arrival had been witnessed by several early morning patrons, and word of its contents began spreading through Dry Creek with the speed that gossip always achieved in small communities. By mid-morning, the saloon was buzzing with conversations about the dangerous gambler who was reportedly heading their direction. Sheriff Webb arrived shortly after breakfast, his expression grim as he approached Annie Lou with the careful demeanor of someone delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "I suppose you've heard about Morrison," he said without preamble. "Just received the telegram this morning. What can you tell me about him?" Webb's hesitation spoke volumes about the nature of the man they were discussing. "Morrison has been operating in this territory for about 5 years. He's skilled at cards, but his real talent is psychological warfare. He destroys opponents' confidence before the cards are even dealt, and those who resist his intimidation tactics often find themselves facing problems that extend well beyond gambling losses." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that require medical attention, if they're fortunate," Webb replied grimly. "Morrison has never been convicted of assault, but several of his former opponents have suffered injuries that conveniently occurred shortly after significant gambling losses. The timing has always been coincidental enough to avoid legal consequences, but the pattern is unmistakable." Annie Lou felt her stomach tighten with apprehension as she realized that her poker success had attracted the attention of someone whose methods of competition extended far beyond anything she had imagined. Morrison represented a level of danger that her sheltered life in Dry Creek hadn't prepared her to handle. "Is there any chance he might simply pass through without seeking confrontation?" Webb's expression provided the answer before he spoke. "Morrison doesn't travel to small towns like Dry Creek for sightseeing. If he's coming here, it's because he views your success as a challenge that requires his personal attention. The morning progressed with a steady stream of visitors, most seeking information about Morrison's expected arrival and its potential implications for the community. Word had spread that Annie Lou was his likely target, and opinions varied widely about how the situation should be handled. Dr. Matthews arrived with medical supplies and advice about treating the kinds of injuries that Morrison's previous opponents had suffered. Judge Harrison came to discuss the legal limitations of what law enforcement could do to prevent violence that hadn't yet occurred. Even Bill Jameson from the bank appeared, his presence suggesting that Morrison's arrival might have implications for local business interests. "Miss Carter," Jameson said with unusual formality, "I hope you understand that recent developments might affect certain financial arrangements that we've been discussing." The oblique reference to her homestead loan sent a chill through Annie Lou's chest. She had hoped to keep her gambling activities separate from her legitimate financial obligations, but Morrison's expected arrival was apparently creating complications that extended into all aspects of her life. "Are you suggesting that my poker playing might affect the bank's consideration of my loan?" Jameson's expression suggested he was choosing his words carefully to avoid saying more than necessary while still communicating his essential message. "I'm suggesting that the bank has an interest in the stability and safety of our community. Activities that might compromise that stability could influence various business decisions." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's arrival was creating pressure not only from criminal elements, but also from the legitimate business community that preferred to avoid association with gambling-related violence. Around midday, Beau McAllister arrived with news that further complicated the situation. His usual confidence had been replaced by obvious concern, and he approached Annie Lou with the demeanor of someone who had received information that challenged all his previous assumptions. "I've been making inquiries about Morrison," he said without preamble. "The news isn't encouraging." "What did you learn?" Beau glanced around the saloon to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard before continuing. "Morrison doesn't just eliminate competition through intimidation. He's part of a network of professional gamblers who work together to control gambling activities in various territories. Your success represents a threat to their monopoly that they're unlikely to tolerate." The revelation transformed Annie Lou's understanding of her situation from a personal conflict with a single dangerous individual into a confrontation with an organized group whose interests extended far beyond Dry Creek. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means that even if you successfully dealt with Morrison individually, others would likely take his place," Beau replied. "You've inadvertently challenged a system that was established to prevent exactly the kind of competition you represent." As the day progressed, Annie Lou found herself increasingly isolated despite the attention her situation was attracting. People were interested in the drama of her confrontation with Morrison, but few were willing to offer practical assistance that might expose them to similar dangers. The exception was Martha, whose loyalty to Annie Lou remained unwavering despite the risks that association might entail. "You don't have to face this alone," Martha said during a quiet moment between customers. "There are people in this community who respect what you've accomplished and who won't stand by while outside criminals threaten one of our own." "I appreciate the sentiment, but Morrison's reputation suggests he's not someone who can be deterred by community solidarity." "Maybe not," Martha replied, "but he's also not someone who can operate freely in a community that's prepared to resist his methods. Law enforcement has limitations, but citizen action doesn't always follow the same constraints." The suggestion of vigilante justice both encouraged and concerned Annie Lou. While community support might provide some protection against Morrison's intimidation tactics, it could also escalate the conflict in ways that might endanger innocent people who had no connection to gambling disputes. As evening approached, the saloon filled with patrons whose conversations inevitably turned to Morrison's expected arrival and its potential implications for Dry Creek. Some expressed confidence that law enforcement would handle the situation appropriately, while others suggested that frontier justice might be more effective than legal procedures. Annie Lou found herself at the center of discussions that ranged from practical planning to wild speculation about Morrison's intentions and capabilities. The attention was overwhelming, but it also reinforced her understanding that her gambling success had transformed her from a private individual into a symbol of broader conflicts between legitimate community interests and criminal enterprise. The evening brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher whose previous criticism of Annie Lou's gambling activities had stung because of its accuracy. Sarah's arrival suggested that even those who disapproved of gambling could recognize when larger principles were at stake. "Annie Lou," she said with uncharacteristic directness, "I want you to know that regardless of my feelings about gambling, I don't believe anyone should be threatened with violence for exercising their legal rights." "Thank you, Miss Jenkins. I appreciate your support." "More than support," Sarah continued. "I've been speaking with other women in the community, and we've decided that Morrison's methods represent a threat to all of us. If he's allowed to use intimidation and violence against you, what's to prevent him from using similar tactics against anyone else who doesn't conform to his expectations?" The observation reframed Annie Lou's situation from a personal conflict into a community issue that extended far beyond gambling disputes. Morrison's arrival represented a challenge to the principle that people should be free to pursue their interests without fear of criminal retaliation. As the evening wore on, Annie Lou found herself contemplating choices that seemed to offer no entirely satisfactory outcomes. Retreat might preserve her physical safety, but would abandon the homestead that represented everything she valued about her family's legacy. Confrontation might save the property, but could expose her to dangers that extended far beyond financial loss. The telegraph message had served its purpose as a harbinger of approaching crisis, but it had also crystallized Annie Lou's understanding that some battles couldn't be avoided, regardless of the risks they entailed. Morrison's expected arrival would test not only her gambling skills, but her courage, her principles, and her ability to navigate conflicts where the stakes extended far beyond money or property. As she prepared for what might be her last peaceful evening in Dry Creek, Annie Lou Carter found herself standing at the edge of a confrontation that would define not only her own future, but potentially the character of the entire community. The choices she made in the coming days would determine whether skills and determination could triumph over intimidation and violence, or whether some battles were simply too dangerous to fight, regardless of what might be lost in retreat. Jack Morrison arrived in Dry Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days earlier than expected, and with none of the fanfare that his reputation might have suggested. He was a lean man of medium height, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed him to blend into crowds until he chose to make his presence known. His clothes were well made, but not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the controlled confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he could be when circumstances required it. More concerning than Morrison himself was what he brought with him, a deck of cards that would later prove to be marked with invisible substances that only he could detect, and a network of associates whose presence in Dry Creek had gone unnoticed until too late. These rigged cards represented the true nature of Morrison's success, revealing that his reputation was built not on superior skill, but on systematic cheating, that his intimidation tactics prevented opponents from investigating too closely. Annie Lou first saw him through the kitchen window as he dismounted from his horse outside the saloon, his movements economical and purposeful in a way that immediately set him apart from typical travelers. Even without knowing his identity, she would have recognized him as someone whose arrival meant trouble for reasons she couldn't immediately articulate. Martha's expression darkened as Morrison pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, his pale eyes scanning the interior with the practiced assessment of a predator evaluating new territory. Conversations quieted as patrons recognized that something significant was occurring, though most didn't yet understand the nature of the drama that was about to unfold. "I'm looking for the young lady who's been causing such a stir with her card-playing," Morrison announced, his voice carrying easily through the saloon, despite its conversational volume. "I believe her name is Annie Lou Carter." The directness of his approach surprised everyone who had expected him to operate through intermediaries or subtle intimidation. Instead, Morrison seemed intent on confronting Annie Lou immediately, as if he viewed delay as a weakness that might complicate his objectives. Annie Lou emerged from the kitchen, with her heart pounding, but her expression carefully controlled. Her grandfather's training had taught her the importance of maintaining composure in confrontational situations, and she understood that showing fear would give Morrison advantages that might prove impossible to overcome. "I'm Annie Lou Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison? Jack Morrison. I believe you've heard my name mentioned in connection with your recent gambling activities." The admission confirmed what everyone in the saloon had suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud created a tension that made the air itself feel charged with electricity. Morrison's reputation had preceded him, and his presence transformed abstract concerns about potential danger into immediate, tangible threats. "I've heard various stories," Annie Lou replied carefully, "not all of them flattering." Morrison's smile suggested he was accustomed to such reactions, and perhaps even enjoyed the fear that his reputation inspired. "Reputations are often exaggerated in the telling. I prefer to let my actions speak for themselves." "And what actions might those be?" "I'm here to extend an invitation," Morrison said, his tone suggesting that refusal might not be a realistic option. "There's to be a game tomorrow evening, private affair, with stakes substantial enough to settle questions about relative abilities. I thought you might be interested in participating." The challenge was issued in language that sounded like courtesy, but carried the unmistakable weight of an ultimatum. Morrison was offering Annie Lou a choice between confronting him at the gaming table or facing consequences that he hadn't yet specified, but that his reputation made terrifyingly clear. "What kind of stakes are you suggesting?" Morrison's answer sent a chill through everyone within hearing range. "Winner takes all. Your recent gambling winnings against the deed to a certain homestead that I understand holds sentimental value. One game, one night, all questions settled permanently." The proposal revealed that Morrison knew far more about Annie Lou's situation than she had realized. His knowledge of the homestead suggested intelligence gathering that extended well beyond casual inquiries, implying a level of preparation that made his confidence seem less like arrogance and more like certainty about predetermined outcomes. "How do you know about the homestead?" "Information travels quickly in gambling circles," Morrison replied, "especially information about players whose success might affect established interests. Your skills have attracted attention from people who prefer to know everything about potential competitors before deciding how to address the challenges they represent." The revelation transformed Annie Lou's understanding of her situation from a localized conflict into part of a larger struggle between individual achievement and organized crime. Morrison wasn't acting independently. He was representing interests that viewed her success as a threat requiring systematic elimination. Before Annie Lou could respond, Sheriff Webb entered the saloon with the purposeful stride of someone who had received urgent information. His presence suggested that law enforcement was taking Morrison's arrival seriously, though the limitations of legal intervention in gambling disputes meant that official protection would be minimal. "Mr. Morrison," Webb said with professional courtesy that barely concealed underlying hostility, "I trust your visit to Dry Creek will be brief and uneventful." "Entirely uneventful, Sheriff," Morrison replied with mock innocence. "I'm simply here to enjoy some friendly card playing with local enthusiasts, nothing that should concern law enforcement." The exchange revealed the frustrating reality of Morrison's methods. His activities remained technically legal as long as he avoided overt violence or explicit threats, allowing him to operate within the boundaries of frontier justice while pursuing objectives that everyone understood but no one could officially address. As the afternoon progressed, word of Morrison's challenge spread throughout Dry Creek, with the speed that significant news always achieved in small communities. Opinions varied about how Annie Lou should respond, but most agreed that refusal would likely result in consequences that extended beyond mere disappointment. Dr. Matthews arrived to offer medical advice about the kinds of injuries that might result from confronting Morrison, while Judge Harrison came to discuss the legal implications of a winner-take-all gambling arrangement. Even Bill Jameson appeared, his presence suggesting that the bank's interests might be affected by the outcome of the proposed game. But it was Beau McAllister's arrival that brought the most significant revelation of the day. His expression carried a gravity that suggested he had discovered information that would change everyone's understanding of the situation they were facing. "Annie Lou," he said with unusual formality, "I need to speak with you privately. There are things about Morrison that you need to know before making any decisions about his challenge." They found privacy in the saloon's back room, where Beau's expression revealed the weight of whatever information he had uncovered during his investigations into Morrison's background and methods. "Morrison's reputation for eliminating competition isn't based solely on intimidation," Beau began without preamble. "He cheats, systematically, professionally, and virtually undetectably. His cards are marked with substances that only he can see, and his associates ensure that any games he plays are rigged in his favor from the beginning." The revelation recontextualized everything Annie Lou thought she understood about the challenge Morrison had issued. This wasn't a test of skill between equals, it was a trap designed to ensure her defeat regardless of her abilities or the cards she might be dealt. "How do you know this?" "I have contacts in the gambling community who've been investigating Morrison's methods for years," Beau explained. "They've never been able to prove anything that would stand up in court, but the evidence is overwhelming. Morrison doesn't win through superior play, he wins through superior cheating." The information should have been discouraging, but instead, Annie Lou found herself considering possibilities that her grandfather's training had prepared her to recognize. Cheaters often became complacent about their methods, especially when they believed their opponents were unaware of their deception. Is there any way to turn his cheating against him? Beau's expression suggested he had been hoping she would ask that question. Possibly. If you know what to look for, and can maintain the appearance of ignorance while actually observing his methods, there might be opportunities to expose his deception in ways that would neutralize his advantages. As evening approached, Annie Lou found herself contemplating the most dangerous gamble of her life, not just accepting Morrison's challenge, but doing so with the knowledge that the game would be rigged against her from the beginning. Yet that knowledge also provided opportunities that Morrison wouldn't expect, chances to turn his own methods against him if she had the skill and courage to execute such a complex strategy. The rigged deck represented everything that was corrupt about Morrison's approach to gambling, but it also represented his greatest vulnerability. Cheaters who relied on marked cards often lost the ability to play honestly, making them predictable in ways that skilled opponents could exploit. As she prepared for the most important game of her life, Annie Lou Carter understood that tomorrow evening would test not only her gambling abilities, but her capacity to outthink and outmaneuver an opponent whose reputation was built on the very deception that might ultimately prove to be his downfall. The stakes couldn't be higher: her mother's homestead, her own safety, and perhaps the future of honest gambling in the entire territory hung in the balance of a single evening's play. The marked cards had revealed Morrison's true nature, but they had also provided Annie Lou with the information she needed to plan a strategy that might transform certain defeat into unexpected victory. Thursday evening arrived with the weight of destiny pressing down on Dry Creek like storm clouds gathering before a tornado. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as word spread that the confrontation between Annie Lou Carter and Jack Morrison would take place at the Red River Saloon, with stakes that extended far beyond the money and property that would officially change hands. In her trembling fingers, Annie Lou held the homestead deed, the legal document that represented everything she valued about her family's legacy and her mother's dreams for the future. The deed was more than mere paper and ink. It was a tangible connection to Sarah Carter's vision of education and progress in the wilderness, a symbol of hope that one determined woman could build something lasting in a world that often seemed designed to crush individual dreams. As Annie Lou studied the familiar handwriting and official seals, she understood that tomorrow night's game would determine whether that vision would survive or perish, along with her own hopes for preserving her family's memory. Martha had closed the saloon to regular business for the evening, transforming the familiar space into an arena where the future of honest gambling in the territory would be decided. The private room had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail, every aspect of the environment designed to ensure fair play, despite Morrison's reputation for finding ways to corrupt even the most carefully supervised games. Sheriff Webb had stationed himself near the door, his presence serving both as official witness and potential deterrent to any violence that might erupt if the game's outcome proved unsatisfactory to either party. Judge Harrison occupied a corner table, his legal expertise available to resolve any disputes about rules or procedures that might arise during play. Dr. Matthews waited in the adjacent room, his medical supplies suggesting that everyone understood the potential for physical confrontation, regardless of how the cards fell. "You don't have to do this," Martha said for perhaps the 10th time that evening, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching a friend walk voluntarily toward obvious danger. "There has to be another way to save the homestead. If there is, I haven't found it," Annie Lou replied, her voice steadier than her hands as she carefully folded the deed and placed it in her reticule. "The bank's deadline is next week, and this game represents the only realistic chance I have of raising the necessary funds." The truth was more complex than Annie Lou was willing to admit, even to herself. Yes, she needed the money that victory might provide, but the confrontation with Morrison had become about more than financial necessity. It had become a test of principle, a battle between honest achievement and criminal corruption that would determine whether talent and determination could triumph over intimidation and cheating. Beau McAllister arrived as the sun set, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood that he bore responsibility for encouraging Annie Lou's involvement in gambling activities that had ultimately led to this dangerous confrontation. His silver pocket watch seemed heavier than usual in his hand, the family heirloom reminding him of the obligations that came with wealth and position in frontier society. "I've been thinking about strategy," he said without preamble, settling into the chair beside Annie Lou with obvious reluctance. "If Morrison is using marked cards, as we suspect, there are ways to identify his deception without revealing that you know what he's doing." "What kind of ways?" "Marked cards typically use invisible substances that become visible under certain lighting conditions," Beau explained, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "If you know what to look for and can observe without appearing to do so, you might be able to identify which cards he's tracking." The technical aspects of detecting card marking were more complex than Beau's brief explanation suggested, but Annie Lou's grandfather had taught her to watch for the subtle signs that indicated dishonest play. The challenge would be maintaining the appearance of ignorance while actually gathering intelligence about Morrison's methods. "The bigger challenge," Beau continued, "will be turning that knowledge into actionable advantage. Knowing that he's cheating won't help if you can't find ways to exploit his deception." As the evening progressed, other members of Dry Creek's community began arriving to witness what many considered the most significant event in the town's recent history. The schoolteacher, Sarah Jenkins, came to represent the women who had rallied behind Annie Lou's cause, her presence transforming the evening from a simple gambling match into a symbol of community resistance against outside intimidation. Tom Bradley arrived with fresh telegraph equipment, prepared to send immediate word of the game's outcome to contacts throughout the territory who were monitoring the confrontation between Morrison's criminal network and local interests. Even Bill Jameson appeared, The banker's presence, suggesting that financial institutions throughout the region were watching to see whether Morrison's intimidation tactics would succeed in eliminating competition that threatened established gambling. Monopolies. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Morrison made his entrance shortly after full darkness fell. He appeared completely relaxed, his confidence suggesting either supreme skill or absolute certainty about predetermined outcomes. Behind him came two associates whose presence had gone unnoticed during their earlier arrival in Townman, whose hard faces and calculating eyes marked them as professionals in fields that extended well beyond gambling. "Miss Carter," Morrison said with elaborate courtesy, "I trust you're prepared for this evening's entertainment." "As prepared as circumstances allow," Annie Lou replied, her voice betraying none of the anxiety that churned in her stomach like acid. Morrison's smile revealed teeth that were too white and too perfect for someone who had spent years in frontier gambling halls. Another detail that suggested his success came from sources other than honest play. "Excellent. I've taken the liberty of bringing cards that I can personally vouch for, ensuring that neither of us will have any concerns about the integrity of our game." The offer to provide the cards was exactly what Beau had predicted, confirming their suspicions about Morrison's methods, while presenting Annie Lou with the challenge of playing against marked cards without revealing her knowledge of their deception. "That's very thoughtful," she replied, accepting the deck with hands that appeared steadier than they felt. "I'm sure your cards will provide an interesting evening." As the formal game preparations began, Annie Lou found herself drawing on every lesson her grandfather had taught her about reading opponents and managing psychological pressure. Morrison's presence filled the room like expensive cologne, his confidence designed to intimidate opponents before the first cards were dealt. But as she studied his face and mannerisms, Annie Lou began to recognize subtle tells that suggested Morrison's confidence might be more performance than genuine certainty. His breathing was slightly too controlled, his smiles lasted just a moment too long, and his eyes moved with the kind of systematic scanning that indicated he was working harder to maintain his composure than he wanted to admit. "The rules are simple," Morrison announced as they took their positions at the poker table. 5-card stud, best of 7 hands, with the understanding that tonight's winner takes possession of all stakes without reservation or appeal. The formal language couldn't disguise the fact that Morrison was proposing what amounted to legalized theft, using his marked cards and intimidation tactics to acquire property that Annie Lou had earned through honest work and legitimate gambling success. "I understand and accept those terms," Annie Lou replied, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. As Morrison dealt the first hand with practiced smoothness, Annie Lou began the delicate process of observing his technique while appearing to focus solely on her own cards. Her grandfather's training had prepared her to notice the subtle variations in how dealers handled marked cards, and she quickly identified the nearly invisible hesitations that indicated Morrison was reading information that should have been hidden. The first hand proceeded according to Morrison's obvious expectations. His betting patterns revealed that he knew exactly which cards Annie Lou held, allowing him to play with the kind of precision that appeared to be superior skill but was actually systematic cheating. Annie Lou lost the hand decisively, but she gained invaluable intelligence about Morrison's methods and timing. "Unfortunate," Morrison observed with mock sympathy as he collected the chips. "Perhaps the next hand will be more favorable." The second hand followed a similar pattern, with Morrison's marked cards, providing him with advantages that made Annie Lou's defeat seem inevitable. But as she continued to observe his technique, she began to identify opportunities that her grandfather's unconventional training had prepared her to exploit. Marked cards created predictable patterns for those who knew how to recognize them. Morrison's confidence in his deception made him careless about hiding the subtle signs that indicated when he was reading marks versus when he was playing blind. More importantly, his reliance on the marked deck had apparently weakened his ability to play honestly, making him vulnerable to strategies that didn't depend on superior cards. The third hand presented Annie Lou with her first opportunity to test the theories she was developing about Morrison's vulnerabilities. Instead of playing the conservative game that her weak cards might normally dictate, she began betting aggressively, using psychological pressure to force Morrison into decisions that his marked cards couldn't help him make. The strategy worked better than she had dared hope. Morrison's confidence faltered when faced with betting patterns that didn't match the information his marked cards were providing, and he made several suboptimal decisions that allowed Annie Lou to win, despite holding inferior cards. "Interesting," Morrison muttered as he pushed chips across the table, his earlier confidence replaced by the first signs of uncertainty. The fourth hand brought Annie Lou a strong, legitimate-hander full house that would have been powerful under any circumstances. But instead of playing it straightforwardly, she used Morrison's reliance on marked cards against him by betting in patterns that suggested weakness when she actually held strength. Morrison fell completely into the trap, his marked cards telling him that Annie Lou's hand was weak, while her betting patterns reinforced that false information. By the time he realized his error, he had committed far more chips than the hand warranted, losing decisively to a strategy that turned his own deception against him. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as observers began to realize that the expected outcome might not be as certain as Morrison's reputation had suggested. Sheriff Webb's expression showed the first signs of hope, while Morrison's associates exchanged glances that suggested concern about developments they hadn't anticipated. "You play more cleverly than I expected," Morrison admitted, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present earlier. "My grandfather taught me that poker is about understanding people rather than just understanding cards," Annie Lou replied, her growing confidence evident in her steadier voice. The fifth hand became a psychological battle as much as a card game, with Morrison attempting to regain his earlier dominance through intimidation, while Annie Lou continued to exploit the weaknesses that his reliance on marked cards had created. The result was another victory for Annie Lou, bringing the score to 3 wins for Morrison against 2 for her. As they prepared for the sixth hand, Annie Lou could see Morrison's confidence beginning to crack. His breathing had become more noticeable, his smiles more forced, and his eyes revealed the kind of uncertainty that came from encountering resistance he hadn't expected and didn't know how to handle. The stakes of the final hands extended far beyond the homestead deed and the money on the table. This had become a battle between honest achievement and criminal corruption, between individual determination and organized intimidation, between the values that built communities and the forces that destroyed them. As Morrison dealt the sixth hand with hands that were no longer entirely steady, Annie Lou Carter prepared for the most important moments of her life, understanding that victory would require not just skill and courage, but the kind of wisdom that her grandfather had spent years teaching her about the true nature of gambling and the deeper truths about human character that cards could reveal. The sixth hand of the decisive game began with Morrison's confidence hanging by threads as thin as spider silk. His earlier certainty replaced by the growing realization that his opponent possessed skills that extended far beyond anything his intelligence gathering had prepared him for. In Annie Lou's pocket, her grandfather's lucky coiner, silver dollar worn smooth by decades of nervous fingers, seemed to pulse with the accumulated wisdom of all the riverboat lessons that had prepared her for this moment. The coin had been Ezra Whitman's constant companion during his gambling career, a talisman that connected him to luck and skill in equal measure. Annie Lou could feel its familiar weight against her leg, a tangible reminder of her grandfather's voice whispering strategies that might yet save everything she held dear. Morrison dealt the cards with movements that were no longer fluid, his technique betraying the stress that Annie Lou's unexpected resistance had created in his usually controlled demeanor. As she accepted her cards, Annie Lou noticed the almost imperceptible hesitation that indicated Morrison was reading the marks on his rigged deck. But she also saw something else. slight tremor in his hands that suggested his confidence was cracking under pressure he hadn't anticipated. Her cards were mediocre, a pair of eights, with unmatched supporting cards that would normally require conservative play. But Annie Lou had learned that Morrison's reliance on his marked deck made him predictable in ways that skilled opponents could exploit, and she began to develop a strategy that would turn his greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The betting opened with Morrison's customary aggression, but Annie Lou detected subtle changes in his patterns that indicated uncertainty about how to proceed against an opponent who refused to behave according to his expectations. Where his earlier play had been smooth and confident, he now showed signs of someone trying to force outcomes rather than letting them develop naturally. Annie Lou responded with calculated restraint, betting just enough to keep Morrison engaged while gathering information about how his stress was affecting his decision-making process. Her grandfather had taught her that pressure affected different players in different ways, and Morrison appeared to be the type who became increasingly reckless when his control was threatened. The hand progressed with mounting tension as each bet and raise revealed more about both players' psychological states. Morrison's marked cards told him that Annie Lou's hand was weak, but his growing paranoia made him question information that had previously seemed reliable. Annie Lou's careful betting patterns reinforced his false confidence while actually setting up a trap that would spring when the moment was right. "You're bluffing," Morrison said as Annie Lou raised his bet, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been present earlier. "Your cards can't possibly justify that level of confidence." "Perhaps," Annie Lou replied with studied neutrality. "But my grandfather always said that confidence comes from understanding the game, rather than just understanding the cards." The comment struck Morrison like a physical blow, reminding him that his opponent came from a gambling tradition that predated his own criminal methods by decades. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, Morrison seemed to realize that he might be facing someone whose knowledge of poker psychology exceeded his own. The final betting round became a battle of wills as much as cards, with Morrison attempting to use intimidation to force Annie Lou into submission while she maintained the calm focus that her grandfather's training had instilled. The room held its breath as the stakes rose beyond anything Dry Creek had ever witnessed, the financial amounts becoming secondary to the symbolic importance of the outcome. When the cards were finally revealed, Morrison's confidence shattered like glass striking stone. His superior hand three jacks should have been enough to win against most opponents, but Annie Lou's pair of eights had been transformed into a full house by community cards that Morrison's marked deck hadn't prepared him to anticipate. "Impossible," Morrison whispered, his face going pale as he realized that his marked cards had somehow failed to provide the information he had relied upon for years. The cards said what you expected them to say," Annie Lou interrupted gently. "But expecting and understanding aren't always the same thing." The victory brought the score to 3 wins for Morrison and 3 for Annie Lou, setting up the 7th and final hand as the ultimate test of everything both players had learned about each other during their psychological battle. The room's tension became almost unbearable as everyone present understood that the next few minutes would determine not only the ownership of the homestead, but the future of honest gambling throughout the territory. Morrison's associates exchanged worried glances as they realized that their leader's reputation for invincibility was crumbling before their eyes. Sheriff Webb's hand moved closer to his weapon as he prepared for the possibility that Morrison might resort to violence if gambling proved insufficient to achieve his objectives. "One final hand," Morrison announced, his voice steadier than his hands as he prepared to deal cards that would determine everything. "Winner takes all, as agreed." Annie Lou nodded her acceptance while touching the lucky coin in her pocket, drawing strength from her grandfather's memory and all the lessons he had taught her about courage, skill, and the true nature of gambling. The homestead deed rested on the table between them like a bridge between past and future, representing everything her mother had dreamed of building in the wilderness. As Morrison's trembling fingers prepared to deal the cards that would decide everything, Annie Lou Carter understood that the next few moments would test not only her gambling abilities, but her capacity to remain calm under the kind of pressure that destroyed lesser players. Her grandfather's coin seemed to whisper encouragement, reminding her that sometimes the greatest victories came not from superior cards, but from superior understanding of the human heart and its capacity for both courage and fear. The final hand was about to begin, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether honest skill could triumph over criminal deception in a world where the stakes extended far beyond money into the realm of principle and justice. The final hand began with Morrison's confidence in full retreat, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate determination of a man whose reputation and livelihood hung in the balance of the next few minutes. As he dealt the cards with fingers that betrayed his growing anxiety, Annie Lou noticed that her simple work, apron-stained with flour and marked by honest labor, seemed to represent everything that Morrison's criminal methods were designed to destroy: authenticity, integrity, and the belief that honest effort should be rewarded rather than exploited. The apron was a humble garment, nothing like the expensive clothes that Morrison and his associates wore, but it symbolized values that had built communities like Dry Creek from wilderness into civilization. As Annie Lou smoothed the familiar fabric, she drew strength from its reminder that she was fighting not just for herself, but for the principle that character mattered more than cunning. Her cards arrived with the weight of Destinia, Queen of Hearts, a King of Hearts, and 3 supporting cards that could develop into something powerful if the remaining cards cooperated. But Annie Lou understood that this final hand would be decided as much by psychology as by the cards themselves, and she began to implement a strategy that would either save everything she valued or destroy it completely. Morrison's marked deck told him exactly what Annie Lou held, but his growing paranoia made him question information that had seemed reliable for years. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his movements jerky, with the kind of tension that came from confronting failure he had never seriously considered possible. "Confident about this hand?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying forced casualness that fooled no one in the room. "My grandfather always said that confidence comes from preparation rather than hope," Annie Lou replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I feel as prepared as circumstances allow." The betting began with Morrison's characteristic aggression, but Annie Lou could see the desperation behind his bold wagers. He was trying to force an outcome rather than letting the hand develop naturally, a fundamental mistake that her grandfather had warned against countless times during their riverboat lessons. Annie Lou responded with betting patterns that appeared conservative but were actually designed to draw Morrison deeper into overconfidence while setting up the psychological trap that would determine the hand's outcome. Her grandfather's training had taught her that the most effective strategies often appeared to be weakness until the moment they revealed themselves as strength. As the community cards were revealed, the room's tension became almost unbearable. Each new card brought possibilities that shifted the mathematical odds, while simultaneously affecting the psychological dynamics between the two players. Morrison's marked deck provided him with information, but information without wisdom was often more dangerous than ignorance. The 4th community card Jack of Hearts transformed Annie Lou's hand from promising to potentially devastating, giving her 4 cards toward a royal flush, while leaving Morrison unaware of how dramatically the situation had changed. His marked cards told him what she held in her hand, but they couldn't account for the community cards that would determine the final outcome. "Interesting development," Morrison muttered, his voice betraying uncertainty that his confident words tried to disguise. Annie Lou maintained her expression of neutral concentration while internally calculating the odds and possibilities that the new card had created. A royal flush was the ultimate poker hand, unbeatable by any combination of cards, but it required perfect circumstances that occurred perhaps once in a lifetime of serious play. The final community card fell like a thunderclap of destiny, the Ace of Hearts, completing Annie Lou's royal flush and guaranteeing her victory, regardless of what Morrison held, or what his marked cards might have told him about her original hand. But instead of revealing her triumph immediately, Annie Lou continued the psychological game that had brought her this far. Morrison's betting had become increasingly erratic as his confidence crumbled, and she wanted to ensure that he committed every possible chip before discovering the true nature of her hand. "I believe the betting is to you," Morrison said, his voice tight with tension as he pushed forward a substantial wager that represented his attempt to intimidate her into folding what he believed was a weak hand. Annie Lou studied his face for a long moment, seeing the calculation and desperation that marked a man whose criminal methods were finally failing him. Then she pushed forward every chip she possessed, calling his bet and raising the stakes to their absolute maximum. "All in," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Morrison's face went white as he realized that Annie Lou was willing to risk everything on this single hand. His marked cards told him that her original hand was weak, but her betting patterns suggested either supreme confidence or complete insanity, and he couldn't determine which interpretation was correct. The room held its breath as Morrison wrestled with the decision that would determine everything. His associates leaned forward with obvious tension, understanding that their leader's reputation and their own positions in the criminal hierarchy depended on the choice he made in the next few moments. "Call," Morrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper as he pushed forward his remaining chips. The moment of revelation arrived, with the weight of justice finally asserting itself in a world where corruption had seemed to hold all the advantages. Morrison revealed his hand first, a full house, kings over jacks, a powerful combination that would have won against almost any other possible hand. His smile of triumph lasted exactly as long as it took Annie Lou to lay down her cards, revealing the royal flush that made his powerful hand completely irrelevant. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Morrison's sharp intake of breath as he realized that his criminal career had just ended in the most public and humiliating way possible. "Royal flush," Judge Harrison announced unnecessarily, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice triumph over corruption through purely legal means. Morrison stared at the cards as if willing them to change, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of broken acceptance that his methods had finally encountered someone they couldn't defeat. His marked deck had told him everything except what mattered most, and his reliance on cheating had left him unprepared for genuine skill combined with legitimate luck. Sheriff Webb stepped forward as Morrison's associates moved toward their weapons, his presence serving as a reminder that violence would not be tolerated, regardless of how the gambling community might normally resolve such disputes. "Gentlemen," Webb said with quiet authority, "I believe the game has concluded according to the agreed-upon rules. Mr. Morrison, I trust you'll honor your commitments as completely as Miss Carter honored hers." The transfer of ownership occurred with the formality that such momentous events deserved. Morrison signed over his stakes with movements that seemed mechanically precise, as if he were performing actions that his mind couldn't quite accept as real. The homestead deed passed into Annie Lou's hands, with the weight of dreams finally realized through a combination of skill, courage, and the kind of luck that seemed to reward those who deserved it most. As Morrison and his associates departed from Dry Creek with their reputations in ruins and their criminal enterprise exposed, Annie Lou found herself surrounded by community members whose support had made her victory possible. The simple work apron that had symbolized her authentic character remained stained with flour and marked by honest labor. A reminder that some values could triumph even in a world that often seemed designed to reward deception over truth. The royal flush had been the ultimate poker hand, but Annie Lou understood that her real victory had come from maintaining her character and principles even when facing opponents who recognized no rules except those that served their immediate interests. Her grandfather's training had prepared her for this moment, but it was her mother's values that had given her the strength to persevere until justice finally asserted itself. 3 months after the night that transformed her from kitchen maid to legend, Annie Lou Carter stood beside the weathered oak tree on her mother's homestead, watching the sunrise paint the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. In her hands, she held a freshly painted wooden sign that would mark the entrance to the property that now belonged to her without question or encumbrance. The new homestead sign represented more than mere ownership. It symbolized the triumph of determination over adversity, of character over corruption, and of dreams that refused to surrender to practical limitations. The sign bore simple lettering that honored both past and future. Carter Homestead, founded 1847, restored 1873. Below the dates, in smaller script, were the words that captured everything Annie Lou had learned about the true nature of success: built on hope, sustained by work, defended by courage. As she positioned the sign at the property's entrance, Annie Lou reflected on the remarkable changes that her poker victory had brought to Dry Creek and the surrounding territory. Morrison's defeat had sent shockwaves through the network of professional gamblers who had used intimidation and cheating to control gambling activities across the region. Several other criminal operations had collapsed once word spread that their methods could be defeated by skill and integrity, creating opportunities for honest players throughout the territory. The homestead itself had been restored to the condition her mother had envisioned, with the small cabin repaired and expanded, the fields cleared and planted, and the beginnings of the school that Sarah Carter had dreamed of establishing. Annie Lou had used her gambling winnings not just to secure the property, but to fulfill the educational mission that had inspired her mother's original purchase of the land. Beau McAllister arrived as she was hanging the sign, his presence now comfortable rather than complicated by the mixture of calculation and attraction that had marked their earlier interactions. Their relationship had evolved from potential business partnership into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values that extended far beyond their initial common interest in gambling. "The sign looks perfect," Beau said, dismounting from his horse with the easy grace that marked all his movements. "Your mother would be proud of what you've accomplished here." "I hope so," Annie Lou replied, stepping back to admire the finished result. "Sometimes I wonder if she would approve of the methods I used to save this place. I think she would understand that sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures." Beau said gently, "What matters is that you never lost sight of the principles she taught you, even when facing opponents who recognize no principles at all." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Hendricks, whose support during Annie Lou's crisis had deepened into the kind of friendship that would last a lifetime. Martha brought news from town and updates on the various developments that had followed Morrison's defeat and the exposure of his criminal network. "Sheriff Webb received another telegram this morning," Martha announced as she joined them beside the oak tree. "2 more gambling operations in neighboring territories have been shut down after their cheating methods were exposed. It seems your victory started something larger than any of us anticipated." The news confirmed what Annie Lou had begun to suspect, that her confrontation with Morrison had been about more than personal survival or property ownership. It had been a turning point in the ongoing struggle between honest achievement and criminal exploitation, a moment when principle had triumphed over profit in ways that created lasting change. As the morning progressed, other visitors arrived to see the restored homestead and to pay their respects to the woman who had become a symbol of courage and integrity throughout the territory. Sarah Jenkins came to discuss plans for the school that would soon begin operating on the property, fulfilling Sarah Carter's original vision for education in the wilderness. Dr. Matthews arrived with medical supplies and advice about establishing the clinic that would serve the surrounding farming communities, another aspect of the comprehensive development that Annie Lou was planning for the property. Even Judge Harrison appeared, his presence lending official dignity to what had become an informal celebration of justice and perseverance. But it was the arrival of Bill Jameson that provided the most satisfying closure to Annie Lou's financial struggles. The banker carried documents that formally discharged all obligations related to the homestead loan, along with a letter of apology for the pressure that banking policies had created during her time of crisis. "Miss Carter," Jameson said with formal courtesy that carried genuine respect, "I want to personally apologize for any stress that our collection procedures may have caused during your difficulties. Your ultimate success in preserving this property reflects the kind of determination and character that this territory needs more of." The apology meant more to Annie Lou than Jameson could possibly understand, representing acknowledgement from the legitimate business community that her methods, however unconventional, had been both legal and admirable. The homestead was now hers without qualification or reservation, secured through a combination of skill, courage, and the kind of luck that seemed to reward those who deserved it most. As afternoon faded into evening, the various visitors began departing, leaving Annie Lou alone with her thoughts and the satisfaction that came from seeing her mother's dreams finally realized. The restored homestead represented everything Sarah Carter had hoped to build, a place where education and hope could flourish together, where individual determination could triumph over circumstances that seemed insurmountable. The oak tree under which her mother had read to her as a child now provided shade for the foundation of the schoolhouse that would soon welcome children from throughout the surrounding territory. The fields that had been overgrown with weeds now showed the first green shoots of crops that would provide both sustenance and income for years to come. But perhaps most importantly, the homestead had become a symbol of the principle that character and integrity could triumph even in a world that often seemed designed to reward deception and exploitation. Annie Lou's victory over Morrison had proven that honest skill could defeat criminal methods when backed by sufficient courage and determination. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Annie Lou found herself thinking about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her about gambling, life, and the true nature of success. Ezra Whitman had warned her that the gambling life could be seductive but ultimately corrupting, yet he had also given her the skills that had ultimately saved everything she valued most. The balance between those lessons, the warnings about gambling's dangers, and the skills that had made victory possible would guide her future decisions about how to use the abilities she had discovered within herself. The homestead was secure, but life would undoubtedly present new challenges that might require the same combination of skill and courage that had brought her this far. Standing beneath the oak tree where her mother had shared dreams of education and progress, Annie Lou Carter understood that some victories were worth any risk, and that the true measure of success lay not in the money won or lost, but in the character revealed when everything important was at stake. The new homestead sign caught the last rays of sunset, its fresh paint gleaming like a promise that some dreams were strong enough to survive any challenge time and circumstance could devise. The little kitchen maid who had served meals and cleaned tables in the Red River Saloon had become a symbol of hope throughout the territory, proof that extraordinary achievements were possible for those who combined natural ability with unwavering determination. But more than that, she had become the guardian of her mother's vision and the builder of her grandfather's legacy, creating something lasting from the convergence of skill, necessity, and the kind of courage that transformed impossible dreams into enduring reality. As she walked back toward the cabin that would soon welcome its first students, Annie Lou Carter carried with her the satisfaction that came from knowing she had honored both her family's memory and her own principles, creating a legacy that would endure long after her own remarkable story had passed into the territory's folklore.